Let me start by asking a question. What was the significance of poverty during the Anglo-American age of slave emancipation?
My name is Chris Florio. I'm a fellow here in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in the history department at Columbia University. I got my PhD from Princeton in 2016. I'm a historian of the 19th century United States, and I'm especially interested in questions about how Americans have debated and experienced moral problems that cross national borders. And so my research looks at one of these problems. It looks at the problem of poverty. And what I'm interested in is how Americans and Britons, during the era in which slavery was abolished, first in the British Empire and then in the United States, understood the significance of poverty to that process of slave abolition. And so I'm really interested in looking at how poverty became really central to the conceptualization, to the implementation, and really to the experience of slave emancipation across the Anglo-American world. This is an illustration that was really useful for me during my dissertation research. It's an illustration from the 1860s of formerly enslaved people waiting in line for poor relief. Right now I'm working on an essay for Reviews in American History, where I'm writing about a few really important books that have come out in the last year or so on the history of American empire during the 19th century. And what I'm really interested in writing about is thinking about the way in which thinking of the United States as an empire during this period changes how we think about this period in US history. When we think about the early 19th century, for example, we usually think about the United States as a new nation. But when you think about it as an empire, you get into these interesting questions about not simply was the United States a nation or an empire, but was the United States an empire and a nation at the same time? So this semester, fall 2017, I'm teaching a course that's actually related to my research interests. I'm teaching a course on the history of American poverty. The course is titled, after a question, it's Does American Poverty Have a History? And obviously the short answer to that question is yes. But one of the things my students and I are thinking about as we continue through the semester is the way in which there really actually isn't a one-size-fits-all history of American poverty. So we're reading material about migrants from Mexico, about sharecroppers in the South, about the homeless right here in New York City. And one of the things we're seeing is the way in which, in fact, there are many different interrelated histories of American poverty. So one of the themes we sort of arrived at so far in this semester, and I think will continue to the end of the semester, is the way in which questions about who were the poor or what is poverty are very much up for grabs across the course of US history. So I've really loved my experience so far here at the Society. I'm now in my second year here, and I mean my students here at Columbia have been really amazing, and my colleagues are wonderful. And one of the things I've really taken from this experience is being able to have long conversations with people whose interests and whose training is really different from mine. And that's been really illuminating for me as I've been working to turn my dissertation into a book. And so, for example, talking to one of my colleagues who's a musicologist about the sensory history of poverty, or talking to another one of my colleagues who's an architectural historian about the spatial history of poverty. These are avenues of inquiry that I hadn't thought of before, but now that I'm going back to my project, going back to my research, going back to my chapters, it's really helping me rethink things in new and I think hopefully very worthwhile ways. I've also been really fortunate to be able to the Justice and Education Initiative here at the Heyman Center to offer a course on the history of poverty at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. And that for me was a very valuable experience. It was a valuable experience to get outside my own research, get outside the Columbia classroom, and at least in some small way try to contribute to bringing education to a group of students who, as a result of a lot of really bad policy decisions, I think, don't have the educational access they deserve. And I would have to say as well, for my project, it really helped me think about the themes that I'm working on historically, how they continue to resonate in the present. So hearing, for example, how my students at Bedford Hill talked about inequality or talking about racism, it really got me thinking about the ways in which these themes, the legacy of slavery, not only structures the past, but in many ways continues to structure the present.